Part 4, Culture Building. Stories, buildings, clothing, and music. These are essential building blocks for any culture. Our ability to adapt them to novel circumstances determines how long our culture will last. Chapter 29, Lewis and Tolkien, Myths and Stories, Part 1. Science fiction. Likely no period of history has been met with greater anticipation than the 21st century. The advent of radio, television, and cinema fueled our technological dreams of the future, and the end of a millennia seemed like an ominous time for a new epoch of human culture to begin. While many of the 100-plus years of sci-fi predictions fell flat, the amenities common to our moment in history would still be viewed as miraculous to our great-grandparents at the turn of the 20th century. While the path of technological progress seems inevitable in retrospect, it was the Hollywood prop departments who shaped the aesthetics of our modern-day marvels. To what extent were the junior engineers at Apple and Microsoft influenced by the images and ideas portrayed on the deck of Picard's Enterprise? The touchscreen tablets and video conversations, Geordi's enhanced optics, the voice-activated computer filled with all the knowledge of the galaxy, and, of course, the holodeck. While the last invention has yet to be perfected, it did accurately predict the favored form of our escapist fantasies. When the vast expanse of the universe is open to explore, a large chunk of our imagination longs to return to the realms of medieval fantasy. There is great value in science fiction and fantasy. While their aesthetics diverge, the two genres are essentially the same. One looks towards a distant past and the other to a far-off future. When we failed to discover the dwelling places of the gods in the distant corners of our own globe, we exported our expectations to the stars and planets beyond our solar system. Asgard is now a technological utopia filled with humanoid aliens dressed in the garb of Nordic heroes, their magic powers fueled by nuclear fusion and illuminated by the ethereal glow of light-emitting diodes. There are as many similarities between the two genres as the gods of Greece and Rome. The magic of fantasy is replaced by the technology of science fiction and back again. The various fantasy creatures of dragons, elves, and dwarves are paralleled by their extraterrestrial alien counterparts. Each type of story allows for a sort of algebraic logic. By mapping the fictional XYZ onto a social or cultural problem that closely mirrors our current situation, we can explore the possibilities without getting canceled for some kind of bigotry. The twin genres present worlds that seem far more diverse than our own, but it's a clever device to help the reader make sense of the plot. The differences between humans, elves, and dwarves, or between humans, Vulcans, and Klingons, appear far more extreme than the differences between various human cultures or individuals. But this broadening view of species and cultures actually serves to narrow our focus and turn it inward. Each of those fictional categories is actually a human being with several aspects peeled away. There is an elf, a dwarf, a Vulcan, and a Klingon inside each one of us, along with an orc, a Ferengi, and a little bit of dragon. The stripped-down aspect of these narratives allows us to understand the intricacies of these storylines through the stereotypical behavior of these different groups. When they act outside their typical role, we become suspicious. Is that Klingon really trying to make peace? Or is it a ruse to allow for a later betrayal? Sometimes the exceptions are crucial to the story, such as the unlikely friendship between the dwarven Gimli and the elven Legolas in The Return of the King. Never thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf. What about side by side with a friend? I could do that. Footnote, I'm fairly certain this quote only occurs in the Peter Jackson film and not the book. End footnote. These differences are even more pronounced in the statistic-driven world of role-playing games, both in their tabletop and video game versions. Can X type of warrior defeat Y? Only when properly optimized around a certain type of skills, weapons, or armor. While such pursuits are seen by many as a waste of time, There are valuable concepts to be grasped that can help us make sense of the world in which we live. The genres preceding these modern categories are twofold. The more colloquial folk and fairy tales, preserved through oral tradition and adapted each generation, and the more formal mythologies preserved in sacred texts. As those ancient myths and folk tales are the basis of much of our culture, we will continue to study them in some detail. But it's worth noting at the outset that the tools used to enjoy and understand science fiction and fantasy are just as helpful in understanding the myths of the ancient world. Classics degrees are not required and probably obscure as many insights as they uncover. As each race or creature is a symbolic imagination of a sliver of humanity, they provide us greater contrasts and clarity than the muddy world in which we must live day to day. People want to apply such contrasts in real life, but the results are always disastrous. There are no purely good or evil people, nor do people groups possess monolithic personalities. Every person and culture is a mix of both light and dark, hard and soft, kindness and cruelty. When we peg one label onto a race or political group, we get ourselves in big trouble. We cannot reduce reality to the clear contrast of fan fiction, but we can use the tools available through fiction to sharpen our perception of reality. The Lord of the Rings. The aforementioned friendship of Gimli and Legolas comes from the most popular work of fiction in the 20th century, J.R.R. Tolkien's epic fantasy, The Lord of the Rings. The three-book saga of Middle-earth built upon the world and characters previously introduced in the shorter adventure, The Hobbit, and contained a variety of unique cultures and creatures with their own highly developed languages, real languages with syntax and grammars built off of Tolkien's expertise as a philologist. The medieval-looking map contained within the book was detailed enough to be of use for serious navigation, yet it was archaic enough to appear as a relic of an earlier age. The map not only allowed a reader to track the progress of the characters as they made their way through the world, but also provided hours of imaginative speculation for the reader, as many of the places detailed on the maps made no appearance in the body of the text. The Silmarillion, a posthumously released collection of writings based on Middle-earth, expanded this world both back in time and towards the edges and outskirts of Middle-earth's geography, detailing the partially finished mythological origins of his world and its inhabitants. This work, and other subsequent releases of unfinished tales and alternate accounts, allowed later readers to fill in the mosaic of the bigger world and compare it to our own. The saga inspired many imitators, though few came close to equaling the narrative depth or internal consistency of Tolkien's story. Though many writers produced longer sagas, none could capture the feel achieved by Tolkien through the intense research of real ancient languages, myths, and histories. Tolkien's work was not crafted out of a desire for fame or fortune, but it was a true labor of love, an imaginative and speculative outgrowth of his scholarly efforts as a professor and philologist. Thankfully, his friend and colleague C.S. Lewis encouraged him to share his stories with the world, and they have been inspiring people ever since they were first published 70 years ago. Though the official lore of Middle-earth is rather small, the real-world myths and legends from which Tolkien drew his inspiration infused the work with a spirit of authenticity. Tolkien and Lewis both rejected the type of reductionist thinking that emerged out of the Enlightenment and the higher criticism of mythologies introduced by thinkers like Schleiermacher. They believed that there was real truth preserved in the ancient stories, but it was encoded within a very different methodology than the systematic method of conveying facts and data through the scientific lens. The clear fact that Tolkien's world was a work of fiction worked to disarm people of the skepticism that had so infected the modern world. A fantasy story, written for entertainment, was not going to be passed off as a work of history, nor would anyone worry about its factual accuracy. Thus, the many defense mechanisms that people would employ before reading a work such as the Bible were set aside when reading The Lord of the Rings. The result of this was that the fictional world of Tolkien served to bring back what had been lost in the lives of modern man when myths and legends were discarded as primitive and false. The books served to help people make sense of the lives they lived, and in many ways provided a bridge between the modern world in which people lived and the places where ancient truths were still valued, the church. Tolkien's work communicated with people on a deep level, what psychologists would likely call the subconscious, though Tolkien would have protested the use of such a term. On the other hand, his great colleague Lewis worked closer to the other end of this bridge, writing children's books like The Chronicles of Narnia that portrayed clear representation of Christian themes in an alternate world. Their two interpretations of how the eternal truths of the faith they both held, though in different manifestations, met in a meta-narrative structure that combined all of their own works of fiction with the myths of antiquity, the sacred texts of Scripture, without discounting the true discoveries of science. The threads of this tale are densely interconnected. The Fellowship of Lewis and Tolkien. Perhaps it's best to start with Tolkien sharing the true myth of Christianity with Lewis. When the latter becomes spiritually alive, he is adopted into the family of God. The two men become brothers in Christ. Despite the history of conflict between the Catholic Church, to which Tolkien belongs, and Lewis Church of England, their friendship connects through that which is common between them, not only spiritually, but in their love of history, language, and literature, and the simple pleasures of pints and pipes. Here I will take the somewhat controversial notion that Tolkien's world resides within Lewis, though Middle-earth is widely regarded as the greater of the two when compared with Lewis' Narnia. The latter has the distinction of being explicitly connected to our own world, as the Pevensey's reside in England, and Aslan the Lion tells them that he is in that world as well. Yet Lewis also imagines a wood between the worlds that connects these realms with countless others. Tolkien's work represents a different sort of fantasy. It's the sort of thing that someone might stumble upon while documenting the tomes and scrolls of an old abandoned monastery. The men of Rohan and Gondor may have been real men from real parts of our world, but somehow their history and legacy were lost when those tribes like the Angles and Saxons lived on to emerge within the history of our present day. It is within the lesser-known fiction of Lewis that the greater meta-narrative emerges. Lewis' trilogy of science fiction stories centers around the protagonist of Dr. Ransom, a fictionalized version of his good friend Tolkien, who is kidnapped to help translate the language of extraterrestrials in Out of the Silent Planet. Lewis himself appears in the second book, Paralandra, as an aide in helping to welcome back his friend Ransom from an adventure on the eponymous planet we refer to as Venus. Footnote. There is a very interesting detail about this book that bears further exploration. Paralandra is a new planet undergoing the genesis of sentient life when Ransom arrives. The work of Immanuel Velikovsky to ascertain truthful observations about the material world through study of comparative mythology led him to make empirically verifiable claims about the planet Venus that were later verified. His book, Worlds in Collision, was published in 1950, but he had previously made his hypothesis known to astronomers and published a paper called Cosmos Without Gravitation in 1946. Lewis' book predates this by 3 years, and although his scientific speculation of outer space seems quite different to what was discovered in the latter half of the 20th century, he may have come to similar conclusions about the planet Venus independently through his own knowledge of ancient myths and cosmology. End footnote. Forgot I'd put that in there. That's interesting. Yet in the third volume, Lewis connects his own work with that of Tolkien's as yet unpublished works, referring to Numenor as the True West. Though this is a different spelling for Numenor than what Tolkien settled on, it's the sort of textual variant that ultimately serves to validate, I guess, rather than refute the likelihood of such a place being real. And Lewis refers to it as another name for Atlantis, the mythical land described by Plato, from which the source of power to travel between worlds in his Narnia originally derives. That Hideous Strength. This final work, That Hideous Strength, is vitally important in our present day. In this work, Lewis connects the orthodox Christian doctrines of angels and demons with the ideas of extraterrestrial beings and the realm of magic. He connects the legend of King Arthur and the magician Merlin with the ancient Roman context of Britain, in which such people may have actually lived, yet brings it forward to the scientific exploration of the occult that was prevalent in the axis of evil. Many are familiar with Hitler's exploration of Nordic mythology and his use of Indo-European or Aryan symbols, but he was not unique in this area of interest. Mussolini had an obsession with the Roman Empire. Beyond the adoption of the fascist political identity, he undertook extravagant public works, including the laborious draining of Lake Nemi to expose the sunken pleasure barges of Emperor Caligula. This effort seemed much more closely linked with the religious implications of the cult of Roman emperor worship, whose analog was literally practiced in Japan. The mythology of the divine ancestry of Emperor Hirohito and his royal family, though purposefully manufactured to replace the Bushido culture that preceded it, bears a striking resemblance to similar tales found around the world, including within the early chapter of the Book of Genesis, of gods taking human wives and bearing sons of great stature and ability. Yet far more compelling are the foreshadowings of what would be yet to come. Published in 1945 with the Allied victory of World War II in sight, Lewis set his tale after the war and placed it within a small college town called Edgestowe, reminiscent of Oxford. In this post-war world, the nationalistic games of empire building have been defeated, yet the seductive influence of the scientific approach as a means to grabbing the reins of humanity's destiny is still very much alive. It has simply retreated to a place where it can regroup under a more civilized facade. Lewis elaborated the ideas behind this novel in The Abolition of Man, a more scholarly and philosophical work of nonfiction. But much like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, the fictionalized account of That Hideous Strength disarms the reader, suspending disbelief until the parallels between fiction and reality become too close to be ignored. Unfortunately, the book performed underwhelmingly in its day, being overlooked in favor of George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World as the dire warnings needed to protect us against a dystopian future. The widespread rediscovery of Lewis' novel shows us that he had a bead on the trajectory of culture all along. The roots of every modern conspiracy can be seen within its pages, and it shows how a society begins down the road that leads to the fearful visions of Orwell and Huxley. The book centers around an Operation Paperclip type research institute. The National Institution for Coordinated Experiments, or NICE for short, is engaged in the new science of pragmatometry, a discipline that, much like the One Ring in Tolkien's epic, seeks to rule over all the other scientific disciplines. The characters within the book communicate the various philosophies of technocrats, transhumanists, and antinatalists in long speeches delivered to the main character, a young sociologist named Mark, who is being initiated into secret ranks of the organization, though later we find out the Institute is mainly interested in the psychic abilities of his wife. It is ultimately revealed that the main interests of the NICE are paranormal and spiritual in nature, astral projection, and demonic possession of a disembodied head. The threads to be untangled in the book could easily fill another volume, and it should certainly be a priority for any thoughtful person to read. My personal conclusion is that the reason Lewis' work failed to capture the imagination of the public the way Tolkien's did is that, much like real life, it's too messy and complicated to easily comprehend. Here is where the divergent worldviews of these two great authors need to be understood, especially in the way they have influenced Christian intellectuals and the ministry of the church. Tolkien's contribution to helping the Christian world rediscover the power of imagination, narrative, and myth as tools to help people navigate the world cannot be overstated. The excellent, if imperfect, film adaptation of his books by Peter Jackson have broadened the influence of his story, exposing millions, if not billions, to the story of Middle-earth, who otherwise would never have picked up the book, while a new generation of readers have explored the greater depth found within his writings. Years that divided different worlds. But there is a point at which Tolkien comes up short, not in reaching his own goals, but in bearing the weight placed on his tales by others. The Lord of the Rings leans too heavily on a desire to live in the past to provide adequate guidance for the future. While both Lewis and Tolkien had reservations about effects of things like technology, only one of them offers a sufficient path forward. Both men survived the liminal space between the old world and the new as veterans of the First World War. Lewis arrived on the front lines on his 19th birthday, whereas Tolkien was 24 years old, a college graduate, and a married man when he first stepped foot on a battlefield. A 5-year difference is not so great in a friendship, but as human beings' brain development and maturation concludes around age 25, Tolkien was literally a creature of a different, older world, while Lewis belonged far more to the new. This fact alone may contribute to the curmudgeonly attitude Tolkien presented towards many changing features of the 20th century, including his distaste for the way Lewis smashed together odd bits of mythologies in his Narnia books. Yet there are more details that separate the two men and their view of the world. Though both suffered tragic childhood loss, Tolkien's was the greater. Having already lost his father at the age of 3, his mother's death made him an orphan at the age of 12. Tolkien's mother was a devoted Catholic who converted at great personal cost and arranged for her sons to be cared for under the stewardship of a Catholic priest. His fierce loyalty to the Catholic faith, with its emphasis on hierarchy, combined with the tragic instability of his childhood, no doubt contributed to Tolkien's representation of an ordered and comprehensible universe. The solution to the problem of chaos was a return to the former ways. While Tolkien was fully aware that this was not possible in his personal life, the deep longing for the unbroken past is deeply woven into the escapist themes of his fiction. This is seen most strongly in the penultimate chapter of The Return of the King, in what is titled The Scouring of the Shire. This chapter has been criticized by many as seemingly out of place with the rest of the work, and perhaps is an idealistic fantasy of wish fulfillment. The lie here is that things can never go back to the way things were, nor is the future simply a better version of the past. While trees may be replanted, the scars of history only fade, they never disappear. The adoption of this worldview is seen in the works of many devotees of Tolkien within the church and the greater Christian tradition. It looks backwards at the past, picking some point where things seem to go inevitably off the rails, analyzes what happened, and seeks to simply reverse this trend. While Tolkien was likely under no delusion that this was possible, his work seems to long for a world prior to the Great War. What could we possibly change, though? Would the prevention of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand have resulted in a timeline moving towards world peace? Clearly, such events are simply the spark that ignites a tinderbox prepped for ignition. Likewise, if Adolf Hitler had never come to power, it is just as likely that the situation in Germany would bring forth someone worse as someone better. The backward looking view to discover what went wrong will take us all the way back to the Garden of Eden and the fall of man. Then we are faced with the decision to blame God for making the tree, for creating the serpent, or for creating the woman, just as Adam did. Yet to arrive at such a conclusion is to equate ourselves with God, believing we are wiser than Him, the same sin committed by the man and the serpent. The idolatry of agrarianism. The other perilous fantasy of Tolkien's worldview is closely tied to the scouring of the Shire, and it rests in what the normal life of hobbits is meant to reflect. The races of Middle Earth are not perfectly analogous to nations of men, but they are certainly reminiscent of broad strokes of historical groups. The men of Rohan and Gondor represent the fallen nature of humanity, prone to corruption and weak in the face of temptation, while the hobbits reflect a different type of humanity, the simple, humble folk who enjoy their agrarian life. The wickedness of hobbits is equated to nothing more than overeating. Whatever Tolkien's true intent was, the subtle influence of his work on Christian thinkers has resulted in a suspicion of technology as such, a glorification of tradition, both in the low sense embodied by the agrarian hobbits and in the magisterium of the Catholic faith, that fans of Tolkien often explore. The backward thinking is seen in Lamentations that churches no longer reside in beautiful cathedrals, that they are failing because they adopted new forms of worship, and that people no longer value the old ways. Yet all they do in response to these mistaken changes is shake their heads. They are betrayed by the conclusion that these things are obvious, one of the most dangerous words we can ever fall prey to believing, because in reality there is no such thing. I equate this worldview with the Roman Catholic faith because of the simple fact that it has always valued unity over freedom and uniformity over flourishing. This is held in the common understanding that the Reformation was a mistake, that the division of Protestant churches into many denominations is a proof of their illegitimacy, and that what is produced, the widespread access to scriptures, the open table, the priesthood of all believers, is a desecration of the holy, instead of a glorification of the simple. The fundamental mistake here is that when Tolkien depicts the horror of the cut down trees, it is analogous with the lament of the cathedrals going away. This is an argument that many people misunderstand. The medievalists portray the cathedral as a glorious undertaking, a unified effort of joyful craftsmen building something together for the glory of God. Yet no one who labored with their hands on the great cathedrals of Europe was able to write down an account of what they accomplished, and the reality was likely far closer to the experience of the Israelites building pagan monuments in Egypt. I guess I'm going to wave my hand so I can find this spot in the video, but I guess what I was saying there is no one who labored with their hands was just to say that most of the builders were probably illiterate. So, we just, all the accounts of we get are from the aristocrats. That's what I was saying there. Okay. We like the cathedrals because we treat them like trees that spring up from the ground, and we find them beautiful. It is sad when cathedrals are destroyed, and it is sad when trees are cut down. But in times of war, these are not the things to be lamented. The exaltation of unity and tradition always results in the commodification of human beings. This was true of the cathedral laborers, the crusaders, and the innocent victims of wars waged by men in high places. If Tolkien were honest, and war in his world was waged by men against men, or hobbits against hobbits, Samwise would not think one whit about replanting trees until he found his Rosie. And if Rosie was dead or taken, Samwise himself would fell every tree in the Shire to bring her back. Christ did not die to save a tree. He died on a tree, and the no one should mourn what was lost in the light of what was gained. I don't know what I did with that sentence there. Wars may be waged by nations and powers, but men only fight and die for the sake of people. There is a school of thought that says Adam ate the fruit because he was afraid of losing Eve. If that's true, it was not the wrong thing to do. God took away the garden, but he did not separate the man and the woman. Adam may well have longed for Eden the way that Tolkien portrays the Hobbit's love for the Shire, but God expelled him with the most valuable thing of all. I do not think that Tolkien would disagree with this personally, and I am sure that he would have just as gladly cut down all the trees in England to save his own wife. It is the interpretation of others that misses the mark. Humble heroes. To give praise where it is due, Tolkien was right in one very important aspect of casting his hobbits as the heroes of The Lord of the Rings, that their perceived insignificance would grant them a better chance at success than a competent warrior who would become an obvious target. However, while this represents an accurate assessment of the hubris of evil men and spirits, there is nothing within the hobbits themselves that should give us faith that they will emerge victorious. It's the belief in happy endings that carries us through. Such criticisms have been placed against Tolkien by people like J.R.R. Martin, who, when interviewed, said the following: Lord of the Rings has a very medieval philosophy. If the king was a good man, the land would prosper. We look at real history, and it's not that simple. Tolkien can say that Aragorn became king and reigned for 100 years, and he was wise and good. But Tolkien doesn't ask the question, what was Aragorn's tax policy? Did he maintain a standing army? What did he do in times of flood and famine? And what about all these orcs? By the end of the war, Sauron is gone, but all of the orcs aren't gone. They're in the mountains. Did Aragorn pursue a policy of systematic genocide and kill them, even the little baby orcs in their little orc cradles? Okay. None of these are questions that Tolkien had any intention of answering with his book. The story was supposed to be seen as more analogous to the Norse myths of Thor and Odin, or the works of Homer, who never told us the tax policies of King Agamemnon either. The mythical simplicity of Tolkien's world is betrayed in the fact that it's almost empty. The visual portrayal of Jackson's Middle-earth seems to reflect the image that the books bring forth. Days and weeks of wilderness separating tiny outposts of civilization. The social strata of Middle-earth are separated in discrete locations, cities of horse lords and kings, hidden elvish enclaves, while the true community of common folk are found in only one place, the Shire. But in attempting to highlight what's wrong with Tolkien's writing, Martin's cynical worldview also misses the mark. His desire to represent the nihilistic chaos of real life in his own fantasy series, A Song of Ice and Fire, resulted in the death of so many main characters that he has written himself into a narrative corner with no resolution. The television adaptation of his series, Game of Thrones, outpaced what he had written in the books and concluded the series with a final season and ending that was almost universally panned. Even though he has a second chance to end his series with strong public feedback, he remains unable to do so. The assumption that worries me, whether or not Tolkien would agree, but as I see it carried forth in others, is the belief that within the simple hearts of simple hobbits, something good and wholesome is destined to conquer the darkest foes. There is an innate quality of perseverance that can emerge from any quarter. We never know when a simple person will endure suffering to complete a task like Frodo, or that a friend like Samwise can be loyal and true to the end. True character is revealed in trying times, but what is miscommunicated in Tolkien's work is where the competency of character emerges within the system of the Shire. When hopeful Christians absorb the narrative of Lord of the Rings as an addendum to the Bible, they tend to project an almost idolatrous hope of salvation on the bucolic lifestyle of the hobbits. The narrative of Scripture, read through a Tolkien-tinged worldview, will read like this. Frodo, Samwise, Merry, and Pippin replied to him, King Saruman, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. From Daniel, that's Daniel 3:16 through 17, with the names changed. This is the view taken by various stripes of traditionalists in regard to the future. Christians are not the only ones who think this way. The same could have been said by the liberal voters who were certain Donald Trump could not be elected in 2016, and by the conservative voters who were certain he could not lose in 2020. The problem is the adoption of a worldview that does not account for the chaotic unknown, the unexpected, or the immediate triumph of evil or good. The Christian hope is in an ultimate eschatological good, but until the final victory, we cannot afford to ignore any temporary defeats. This truth is revealed in the next verse. But even if he does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Daniel 3:18, emphasis added. We tend to overlook the significance of this verse because, in the story, the three youths are delivered from the fiery furnace. But many more men and women have echoed their sentiment and found no deliverance in this life. For every shire scoured of evil, there may be 100 or 1,000 villages that lay fallow and barren. God did not deliver Latimer and Ridley from the flames, nor did he stop the fall of Constantinople, nor did he stop the purging of Hungary, the Cultural Revolution of China, or the rise of the Khmer Rouge. In the rear view of world history, the peaceful respite enjoyed by the England that Tolkien loved was the rare outlier. If the British good triumphed over the German evil, it was only because they were good and had nothing to do with being British. The current sad state of affairs in England was predicted with supreme accuracy by Lewis, except that the NICE was toppled at the end of that hideous strength, whereas in the 21st century, they have gained total control. If the little kingdom of Logres within the haven of St. Anne's remains intact, its peaceful existence can only be maintained through constant vigilance. But vigilance requires competence and flexibility. It's the ability to take the raw talent of acquiring skills in general and being able to see how they are best used now and in the future. Is Tolkien now obsolete? Definitely not. His innovations into the world of fantasy writing are staggering. The point of this thought experiment is not to pit Tolkien against Lewis, but rather to highlight how Tolkien's story fits within Lewis' frame, and within that frame, it can be celebrated for all of Tolkien's achievements. Tolkien has given us a fantastical link to our human past, the great value of which is that we can now take the tools learned by dissecting Middle-earth and reapply it to Homer, to Beowulf, to the stories of Odin and the myths of Persia. But we can also project it forward to the works of Tolkien and Lewis' successors. Myth makers of today, architects of the future. Let us return again to the wood between worlds, where we now know connections exist between our world and Narnia, and we can assume that if Middle-earth is not a place in our own past, but another world entirely, then a portal must exist to that world too. In that limitless space, we can connect to Martin's world of Westeros, as dour and depressing as the dying world of Charn, or any other world. There is great value in stories, in fiction, as they provide models and prototypes for how we live our lives. Tolkien's work especially shines in this regard because although there are flaws, we can inhabit Middle-earth in our imaginations, especially within the Shire. Lewis' worlds all lead us back to our own world so straightforwardly that they are hard to inhabit for any length of time. What both authors would likely agree on is that there is some value in using a story to understand the world as a reader. but it is an even more powerful tool when used as a writer. The reader observes, but the writer participates. This principle is the key behind the creation mandate and the Great Commission. Both are fulfilled when we follow Christ in the act of creation and multiplication. For this reason, the greatest writers of the next generation were not those who emulated the forms. Sorry. Okay. I'll just start that paragraph over. This principle is the key behind the creation mandate and the Great Commission. Both are fulfilled when we follow Christ in the act of creation and multiplication. For this reason, the greatest writers of the next generation were not those who best emulated the forms created by Tolkien or Lewis, nor were they those Christians who sought to infuse the message of the gospel in a form that would appeal to readers. The best writers were those who succeeded in following the spirit of Tolkien and Lewis. They sought to understand the world through writing. Those who did so honestly would discover that for their tales to accomplish what they needed, they would have to fill the pages with truth about their own lives, their fears and traumas, and to find a solution, an alternative past. They would ultimately need to have their characters reflect the nature of Christ. Though he has been called the American Tolkien, George Martin's unfinished work reflects his failure to do this. He should have left his work unpublished until he found the conclusion. If he had done this, unlike Adam and Eve, he could have gone back to discover what went wrong, even if it had been on the first page of the first book. From the Shire to the Two Rivers. This does not mean that everyone needs to become a writer, but it does mean that everyone must become a creator. If fiction remains entertainment alone, without inspiring change, it's like someone eating the seed grain instead of planting it in the ground. Keep in mind the importance of Jesus' teaching in parables is that it brought spiritual significance to the tasks that he spoke about. Remember, the farmer, the fisher, the baker, or bookkeeper would not be convinced of the wisdom Jesus had to share if he didn't get the details of their craft right. The Bible is our primary source for helpful narratives, but as we have learned, there is great value in stories like those of Tolkien and Lewis. But for the goals of our project, there is another fictional tale that is better suited to convey the message. Deeply inspired by Tolkien, Lewis, and a myriad of other sources, the true American Tolkien is James Oliver Rigney, best known by the pen name of Robert Jordan. Jordan's epic fantasy series, The Wheel of Time, spanned a massive 15 volumes, and like Tolkien, required posthumous help to be completed. The ending of his tale was crafted by Jordan himself, and unlike Martin, the path towards that end was clear. The parallels between Jordan and Tolkien's lives are highlighted by the similarities and differences within their works. Like the work of Lewis, the work of Tolkien can live within the work of Jordan, who very much would have seen his world as both a representation of our own past and future, as well as another destination from the wood between the worlds. Tolkien wrote from the perspective of an Englishman and reflected the national identity of that land, which developed through a modest history of blended cultures and immigrant tribes. Though the history of that land was shaped through conflicts, the differing factions shared in a greater European identity, born out of the unity of the Holy Roman Empire, and contrasting them with the people on the fringe, such as the Haradrim, reminiscent of the peoples of Carthage, Persia, and the lands beyond. In contrast, Jordan's writing reflects the much broader cultural diversity of America, with many more people of diverse appearance and custom. While the various groups display contempt for groups outside their own, the narrative itself places no hierarchy of values upon the differing peoples. Like Tolkien, he was shaped by the experience of going to war, but unlike the hero's welcome received by veterans of the Great War, he lived through the meat grinder of Vietnam, and returned to a nation that treated the returning soldiers with contempt. Both authors' series represent a turning of the age, which comes about through a final conflict. Yet while the progression of Tolkien's ages are presented in a linear fashion, the ages in Jordan's world are cyclical in nature. In this system, there is a possibility of a final conclusion presented, but it seems to be a negative apocalypse, an end of all things. When the series finally ended, some people were upset that it did not provide the type of ending hoped for by some, though it should have been predicted. It provides as much closure as anyone can expect in the story of their own life. The final outcome is perceived through faith alone. A fuller analysis of the themes within Jordan's epic work could become as long as the series itself, if not longer. So I will conclude this discussion by highlighting the one area where I find Jordan's work to be truly superior to Tolkien's: the difference between the Shire and the two rivers. The similarities between the two places is immediately obvious. Hold on, I gotta take a break. I think it's all right. The similarities between the two places is immediately obvious. Jordan borrowed most heavily from Tolkien in the first volume of his series, The Eye of the World, which parallels the narrative of the Fellowship of the Ring. This was intended as an homage. However, it has provided a bit of a stumbling block that has prevented diehard fans of Tolkien from engaging deeply with Jordan's work, as they think it's too derivative. However, if they are able to push through the first volume, they will find a myriad of different branches stemming off of Tolkien's tree, many of which bear fruit cultivated with our 21st century experience in mind, and they all stem out of the culture portrayed in the village of Emond's Field in the Two Rivers. The Two Rivers is a place of humans. Virtually all of the characters in Jordan's work are human. While Tolkien used the creation of many races to bring out differences in human cultures, the trope became overused as people simply tried to imitate the aesthetic style of Tolkien. This is helpful because instead of viewing the distinctive differences through the lens of an innate nature of hobbits, dwarves, or elves, the strengths and weaknesses of various groups come from their cultural wisdom and experience. There are genetic differences, but they are less important to the overall success or failure of the various groups. Going beyond class to culture. As an example of this is the Aiel, Jordan's desert warriors, who are reminiscent of the Fremen of Arrakis in culture, but who are depicted as looking physically like Scottish Highlanders. This means that the Aiel men are among the most physically strong, yet their culture also contains female warrior societies. Physically speaking, there is a massive advantage of even average men over the strongest women. Yet Jordan portrays the learned disciplines of a hard life in the desert as giving these women an advantage over male fighters of other groups. People may scoff at this fictional account, but in our age of firearms, trained female soldiers and policemen who have practiced shooting would have a substantial advantage over men who have not trained at all. Footnote: this analogy actually demonstrates quite clearly the current problems between men and women. The skills most valued in today's economy are more easily attained by women, who are more apt to endure through a college career and make their way into a digital workforce. The physical advantages of being male are less of an asset and more of a liability in our current day. End footnote. The Aiel are one of many highly specialized cultures shown within Jordan's world. There are other martial-minded groups like those who live in the borderlands who are focused on defense, like Tolkien's men of Gondor, or the cavalry, like the Riders of Rohan. There are also cultures more specialized in business, politics, bureaucracy, and thievery. Many of these cultures feature aristocracies or hierarchies that are used to sort the elite from the common. As in our own societies, systems of credentialing allow people to quickly assess whether someone is worthy of respect or indifference. The standouts, much as in our own culture, are often those who have devoted themselves to a particular craft in the absence of positive affirmation. The consuming drive that motivates someone to become worthy of adoration is often fueled by a rebellion against the world that continuously tells them they are not special. We see this in the lives of celebrities, business owners, and political leaders. In Jordan's story, we often see it most clearly in the villains, but it is present in many ancillary characters, reminiscent of the way Boromir and Faramir are both shaped into highly skilled, yet flawed characters by the unhealthy pressures placed upon them by their mentally unstable father. All of this stands in contrast with the heroes of the story and the many later characters who emerge out of the two rivers. To read the first book only, we would be inclined to think that it was simply the twist of fate that caused a diversity of interesting characters to emerge from this small community. Yet as the narrative unfolds, there is something hinted at in the first book that plays out more fully across the series. The Two Rivers represents a type of culture that successfully reproduces quality and competency to an unusual degree. While the rest of the nations praise their superstars in whatever fields of specialization they most value, these simple young people routinely show an ability to outperform the experts. They do not show the same respect for the way that a culture transmits its expertise. They are problem solvers who rely on the analogous wisdom learned through simple skills to navigate the problems they encounter in new lands. Some examples of this are Rand climbing the wall of a palace that no one in the city had ever attempted, simply to get a better view of a procession going through the street. He compares it to climbing the rocks in the woods back home. Matt, who challenges the two best sword fighters in a practice match, besting them both by using a staff that every farmer in his community knows how to wield. And Perrin, who as an apprentice blacksmith in the Two Rivers, shows a higher level of skill and competency than many journeymen in larger cities. These anecdotes are littered throughout the book, but there are also routine examples where, even besides the main characters, an average youth from the Two Rivers is more proficient in archery or working with horses than the best trained soldiers. Their hunting skills make them better trackers and sneakier scouts. But what is most startling about these characters is their relational fortitude. This is, of course, where Tolkien's hobbits also are shown most brightly, in their loyalty towards one another. The protagonists in Jordan's work have times of disagreement, but when they come together, they are stronger for their ability to rely on each other. Someone reading this may be thinking, so what? It's a fictional story. They can make people however they want. But this misses the point, because Jordan provides the receipts as to where this competency comes from. The Two Rivers is an unknown place to most of the inhabitants of the larger world because they do not spend their resources to acquire fame or notoriety. Their goods are of an excellent quality but humble appearance because the investment of their energy and resources is to put into what is truly most valuable, their children. This is a rather unique factor among fantasy stories. With several main protagonists, Jordan highlights the different ways that a community focused on passing on their values to the next generation can adapt to different circumstances. Only one main character, Rand, has a more classic fairy tale backstory. As an infant, he was rescued from a battlefield by a soldier named Tam, who had left the Two Rivers to see the wider world. Tam moved back home to raise the child with his wife, who had been unable to conceive. Due to her own tragic passing, Tam ended up raising the child by himself, with considerable help from those in the community. Though he is separated by great distance, his role as father has an important impact throughout the life of the series. Matt has a rebellious streak, but follows closely in the footsteps of his father, who has a bit of a reputation as a horse trader, but ultimately is extremely loyal to his friends and family. He is like the son in Jesus' parable who says, "I will not," when asked to work, but always ends up going. Matthew 21:28 through 32. His father and some other men set out on a journey to discover what has happened to their children after a long absence of communication, a detail that is not typical of fantasy stories, but rings true of life. Perrin is also portrayed as coming from a healthy and intact family, with many extended family members living on a farm. With so many mouths to feed, Perrin goes to live with the blacksmith and his family in the town as an apprentice. Throughout the series, he refers to Master Luhan and his wife as role models and mentors. The couple seem to put a great deal of effort into helping him mature and grow, rather than viewing him as a source of labor. This shows the kind of responsibility that a healthy community takes in raising up the next generation, even if they are not a biological family. Egwene is the daughter of the town innkeeper, who is also the mayor. He and his wife are responsible for the hospitality of the whole village and show kindness towards outsiders, while exercising prudence in protecting their own from outside influences. Although we do not see as much interaction between them and their daughter through the course of the series, we find out much later on that Egwene has been sending letters back to her parents on a regular basis. The main characters do not represent a static culture. Each of them change dramatically over the course of the series as they adapt to new circumstances and environments. Yet despite these changes, they are able to maintain a connection with the people and place of their upbringing. Despite different characters questioning, compromising, or rejecting certain values they were raised to uphold, they also honor others, including values that are difficult to stick to in our own world, such as abstinence before marriage. It may seem odd to suggest that a fantasy series is the place to find such values, but the fantastic nature helps us to see what is common between our own world and what is portrayed in the book. There are certainly other works of fiction and nonfiction that can provide similar examples. Pa Ingalls from the Little House series is a great example of a good husband and father. Penny Baxter of The Yearling is another figure with much to teach. Yet it's easy to dismiss an example like that as being a product of the pioneer days. If only things were like that now. Charles Ingalls the man would have to make different decisions if he was alive today. But if he had the same character and values, he would still make good choices. The times in which we live have shifted so rapidly that there is no model we can point towards for how to succeed. The path of success that our fathers discovered no longer leads to the same place. By looking at a slew of different stories, fictional, biblical, historical, and in the present day, we can start to discover the true path forward.